We want to tell you how pleased we are to have you here, how much we admire you, and how much we appreciate your presence here.
Devo confessar.
I have to admit that in coming up the elevator that brought me to this room, if I were to be asked what I expected to find, I wouldn't have known what to answer. I knew that a few people were meant to come, who were so kind to come here to listen to me. But if I had been told that I would hear the speech of President Iglesias that we just heard, I would have said that's impossible. And it's impossible. Why? Because I'm in a bank. The banks have a language well known to all of us, unfortunately much too familiar to all of us. And for me, to come into a bank as imposing as this bank is, that one can see as one walks in, which is rather intimidating, I must say, and to then listen to words that could have been said, I won't say by political leaders, because political leaders can say anything, but by someone. And I have to acknowledge that this someone is President Iglesias himself and probably half of the bank. Words that could have been said in entirely different circumstances and for a different purpose, because we would have been debating things having to do with each of our lives and the lives of all of us. And since we're used to the idea that a bank doesn't have a soul, although I have to confess that today, because I had to cash a check, I walked into a bank here in Washington, and I never saw anything that looked more like a church. The clerks, very serious and expressionless, but at the same time, as if they held divine wisdom in their hands. So to come here, and now let's go straight to the heart of the matter, to come in here and to listen to those words, I have to say, though, watch out, because I'm going to remind you of those words for the rest of your life. Because it's not enough just to say them. Mind you, saying them is already quite a bit. Having said them, though, commits you. And with this many witnesses, nobody can say that I'm not telling the truth, because I will call all of those here to bear witness. So I will be attentive to what this bank and what you personally do henceforth. On the other hand, when I come to something like this, I'm never quite sure what it is I'm going to say. So I'm waiting for something to happen either outside of the elevator or inside the elevator that gives me an idea, and I say, okay, this is what I'm going to use. A great deal has been said of a literature called a literature of evasion. Those books that we buy and read to relax and think of something other, to entertain, to leave where we currently are. That doesn't mean that they're not good books. They're excellent books that are intended to do precisely that. And even those authors exist and write. But nothing has ever been said of a literature that I would call of invasion. A literature of invasion. We talk about a literature of evasion, but never of invasion. On the one hand, we have a literature that makes us leave, and another one that brings us in. I don't want to speak too much about myself, but I don't remember that this has ever happened. And mind you, I'm not casting any judgments of value or any opinion as to the relative quality of the different types of books. But I really don't think I've ever written any sort of literature of evasion. And I had never understood until today that if there is any designation that we could use to describe what I write, and I say this for the first time because this is the first time the thought has occurred to me, this would be a literature of invasion. A literature of invasion that has more or less expressed itself throughout my writing career, whether in articles in the newspapers, in essays, or in the theater, and of course in the novels. Before I go on to say what I'm intended to say, since I've mentioned the theater, let me mention briefly a theater piece that I wrote on which an opera was based. What takes place in that play happened in a university in northern Germany in the middle of the 16th century, 1530, something like that. That was the period of the major religious conflicts in Europe. Therefore, Lutheranism, Catholicism, is the time of Charles V that is mentioned so often nowadays. And in the Protestants were Baptists because they believed that baptism could only be given at a mature age, but if not mature, at least at an age when the individual could say, yes, I want to be baptized, as compared to the Catholics who baptize immediately. The result was that the city was encircled by Catholic troops in a siege that lasted about 14 months. The city originally had about 13 or 14,000 inhabitants, and at the end of the siege there were slightly over 2,000. All the others had been burnt or beheaded. It's the old story of intolerance which pursues us and that we can't quite get rid of. This really is connected to the literature of invasion, more so that in the case of this work, which is called In the Name of God, In Nomine Dei, and it places or will place God, assuming that he exists. I mean, I don't believe it, but he said, I don't even believe he exists, but I do think he's a pretty good person. This is going to place a God before a very difficult situation, because at the day of the final judgment, if that ever comes about, billions of people will come to stand before God, but the Catholics and the Baptist Protestants will also come before God to be judged. Now, the delicate issue that God is going to have to settle is, what does he do with them? Does he welcome the Catholics and sends the Protestants to hell? He can't do that. He can't do that because the Protestants also believe in him, and they even sacrifice their lives for him. Does he welcome the Protestants and sends the Catholics to hell? No, of course not. So human stupidity, and of course we've known this for many years, but the human stupidity is of such magnitude that in the case that God exists, there can only be one God. There can only be one God. we kill each other off because of God, without realizing that on the one hand, that the most absurd of all the wars are the religious wars. That's the most absurd one, the one that shouldn't absolutely ever occur. On the other hand, it seems that we don't notice that to kill in the name of God turns God into an assassin, which is unthinkable. God couldn't possibly be that. If I made this comment on this play, is to insist on in talking about the litter of invasion, I want to say that once I concerned myself, even though President Iglesias said that the bank is concerned, but I want to tell him that nobody in the world is more concerned than I am. But that means that I would be an excellent advisor to the bank, because the bank has so many concerns, and I could add my own concerns to that, and then I would see how far we could take all these concerns. This idea that the world isn't doing well, on the contrary, it's doing pretty badly, and that this world is a disaster, is something that pursues me almost obsessively. And I've already been asked, why do I worry so much? And they say, listen, you're healthy. You won the Nobel Prize. You have thousands and thousands, if not millions of readers throughout the world that are very interested in reading what you write. You're happily married. You have a wife that you like, and you have reasons to believe that she likes you as well. And on top of that, you have 3 dogs. You have a garden. You live on a beautiful island, Lanzarote, with the sea in front of your house. So why do you worry? And I said, I think it was yesterday, in the University of New York, I said that when I die, and I sure hope that doesn't happen until I'm 99, if they were to put a headstone wherever my earthly remains are to be buried, to use this euphemism, they could put the following inscription: "Here lies José Saramago, who is shocked, who is indignant." Why is indignant? For having died, of course. But also indignant for many other things that worried him while he was alive. And what worries him is the world that we live in. It just so happens that after I wrote the Gospel according to Jesus Christ, which is the reason that Pilar and myself live in Lanzarote, even though the real responsible is the Portuguese government, who at the time censored the book. I don't know whether that made any sense or not. I don't think it does. Before the revolution, we had to put up precisely with this, the dictatorship and fascism and censorship and the police and prison, all of that we had to put up for 48 years. We didn't expect that in the middle of our so-called democracy, censorship like that could take place. And the book wasn't taken out of the bookstores, but I wasn't allowed to, it wasn't a candidate to a European prize, and it had been selected by many cultural institutions, supposedly institutions that knew what they were talking about. So the government forbid that and didn't allow us to participate for this prize. Since I won't only be indignant after dying, because I was indignant before I died, that indignation that I expressed in several ways is what led me to leave Portuguese. It's not that I broke with my country's my country, but that's the way I found to protest, by moving elsewhere. Now, I said that after the gospel according to Jesus Christ that was harshly criticized, the Vatican called me every possible name, and there's no law that prevents them or punishes them. They can call me anything they want. But after the gospel according to Jesus Christ, something happened in my life. There's no difference between what I have been doing over time, and this happened in 1993, 94, along more or less then. I wrote a book called Blindness. In English, it's one of the few words that I know how to say, blindness. And it's been published here. And this is a book that I imagine there are a few here who have read it, that begins saying very clearly, but at the same time telling to a literary genre which isn't quite commonly used today, which is the allegory. And it might be worthwhile saying something about that. The allegory in the heroic times with the literary use of allegories, which was also used in painting and in sculpture in the 17th century or even in the 18th century. In the 19th century, it had become sort of a degenerative form of allegory. But apparently there doesn't seem to be any need for this after structuralism, realism, all those isms that we now have, and let's not forget romanticism. Apparently, the realistic description of what we call reality was what I used. But I think what I believe is that people quickly lose their focus. The attention span is short. They can't stay focused on a topic and in a way of listening to it. They get tired of discussing it. We can see this in the way one looks at a painting or looks at a sculpture or reads a book or listens to a musical composition. So without having thought about it beforehand, this is something that came to me naturally, blindness is an allegory. As you know, those of you who have read it and those of you who haven't, you're now going to have many reasons to run to the bookstore and buy it, to see to what extent the book concerns the concerns of the author that has already more or less expressed them here. The book tells an absurd story, as absurd as is, for instance, my romance, The Stone Raft, where I break the Iberian Peninsula from Europe and I turn this peninsula into a raft that is navigating without sinking. It goes by the Azores and it turns towards the South Atlantic. And that is also a metaphor. This book at the time was seen as a protest against Europe's and Spain's integration or into the European community. There is a bit of that, bit of truth in that. I have to recognize it. This book is, among other things, the result of a personal and historic resentment. Personal resentment, why? Because historical resentment leads to personal resentments. Historical resentment in the following sense. As we know, until very recently, it's not worthwhile thinking when exactly, but until very recently, Europe, as far as those who at the time were already considered Europeans, ended in the Pyrenees. Everything beyond the Pyrenees was something picturesque and sort of vague, where there are bullfights. They also have them in southern France, but where people sing the fado, and where it becomes very close to the Africa And so after so many centuries, after the era of the discoveries had left us many years when we had such good navigation techniques, the Spanish too, but we were a bit better at it than the Spanish were. After that, we entered a period of decadence, and we were, in fact, those that even after joining the EU were considered the apprentices. So as a result of this was the result of a personal historical resentment, as if to say, you don't like us? Okay, we're leaving. But I remember a criticism by a politician who wasn't even a literary critic who said, what this man is telling us isn't what it appears to be at first blush. What he's saying is that he would like the Iberian Peninsula to become the engine to pull all of Europe to the south. If we were to think of this, we could say, what would it mean to pull Europe to the south?
The reviewer is right, because I was concerned about this book, thinking that it meant that, but his review really clarified my thoughts. I think he was in this following sense, which is very clear. I think Europe owes something to the South. And by South here, I mean something that is not totally geographic, not the southern half of the Earth. South sometimes gets into the northern part of Earth, really. But what the rich Europe owes to the South is part of the wealth of Europe, because this wealth was taken from, and that's the mildest way I can put it, was taken from the South. So therefore, this trip of Europe towards the South had another meaning. One meaning was, of course, to uh, to to give back what had been taken, the goods, the wealth that had been taken. The British Museum, for instance, has a great collection of art from the Parthenon in Athens, and apparently the British Museum is not ready to return those works to Greece. Therefore, when talking about returning these objects, I mean the objects that have been taken or stolen or whatever you want to talk about. Uh, we could also talk about Africa. I'm not a technician. I'm just a citizen, a writer. But in my opinion, the problem of Africa cannot be solved without a very simple thing that everybody deals with economics and finance understand. And it's a verb. The verb is to invest. It's not worth thinking that we could resolve the problem in Africa without doing now what the colonial powers did not do in the past. To the island of Lanzarote, where I live, every day many Africans land, many die before getting to land. Nigerians, Senegalese, Sierra Leoneans, people who come from Africa and cross the Mediterranean. There are hundreds of cadavers in the Mediterranean, dead bodies. Some people say that in Spain we eat the fish who ate the bodies of the Africans who drowned in the Mediterranean. It's a piece of black humor, but this is true too, because well, countries eat whatever they can eat, and fish do it too. And a dead body is good food for fish. And I think that I've spoken enough to show why, all the reasons why I should be president of this bank instead of President Iglesias. But anyway, all these ideas led me to write Blindness. You know the story. You know that all the inhabitants of a country, of a city, or the world become blind in a very few days. Everyone becomes blind. this distortion. It is a strange kind of blindness. It's a white blindness. And I think that easily we all associate blindness to darkness, to to darkness. But this blindness I've written about is a white blindness, as if everybody was, you know, plunged in milk with open eyes. How did the book start? I was at a restaurant thinking, and I don't know what. I was certainly not thinking about blindness or blind people or milk, but waiting for my food, I asked myself a question. And this is the question. What if we were all blind? And I answered to myself right away this, but we are all blind. And then, of course, this basic idea became a novel of 300 pages, and that is, of course, what the writer does. This is the work of the writer. He thinks about an idea, develops it, until he sits down and writes it. Therefore, this is a metaphorical blindness. Of course, people are not literally blind. They can see, but organically, physically, they're not blind. And that is, of course, a realization that we come to at the end of the book when everybody sees again. But when I say we're blind, what is it that we don't see? I think, and I think that everybody agrees with me, that this prodigy that took hundreds and thousands of years to make up and within our brain, within our head, what we call reason. It's this product, our brain, and we call reason. But I think that we should really ask ourselves very deeply, what does it really mean to say that we have reason? And I think that we should be a little more humble. And as hard as it may be for us to accept this idea, I must say that that animals defend life much better than human reason does. Animals kill or die, they eat, and there was a balance among living creatures, the food chain, as we call it. And within that balance, nature is like a big dining room where over and over again the same cycle takes place: to eat and to be eaten, to eat and to be eaten. This is life. This is what happens. As we speak now in the world, millions and millions of animals are dying or being killed, and they're being killed so that tomorrow we can eat tomorrow. And even the vegetarians cannot say that we're the barbarians because we eat meat, because millions and millions of plants are killed by vegetarians, and this is the only way to do it. I mean, there's no other way to proceed. But human reason, the same human reason, together with intelligence and sensitivity, this reason that led to painting the Sistine Chapel, write Don Quixote or Moby Dick. Since I'm in the States, I have to cite that too, and to produce so many more works that created philosophy, law, beauty. We have created beauty. We invented it. It didn't exist before we created it. We created love. Love didn't exist before us. What a crazy idea. Does anybody think that a caveman would tell his woman that he is the light of my eyes? You or she is the light of my eyes? Of course not. Of course not. So we have created all this. We invented all these ideas. So every day, of course, the sun would go down into the ocean behind a mountain, and people would worry, is the sun coming back tomorrow or not? And as the sun came back every day, they got used to it. But they didn't see any beauty in that until someone with, God knows, with words said, how beautiful that is. And that was the birth of what we call beauty. We created all that, of course. Well, all that as our assets in the assets column. I'm, of course, in a bank, therefore, I'm doing a little bit of accounting here, talk about assets and liabilities. In the liabilities column, what do I put in that column? There I put, of course, the most absurd of things.